Hi, Ron. Thank you so much for doing this interview. I really appreciate your time, and I hope that you enjoy answering the questions that I've prepared for you. There are 5 questions. Here we go. Tell me a little about Champions Now. What excites you about it?
Wow, what doesn't? First, there's the excitement of having reflected upon these first generation rules and kind of rekindled and realized so much more about what they were and how we arrived at some of the things we did by accident almost as we tried, and realizing how much fun it is to do it now. And so part of it is simply and only the game itself, and then being able to say this can be really refined into something extraordinary. That's part of it, both a play excitement and also a creative design challenge. There's also sort of the social side of it in the course of all that blogging, realizing and discovering how many people felt the same way and how many people, upon observing that, then said, really? Can I play too? And to recognize that there was a real enthusiasm. There is a sense of social excitement among us. And it keeps hitting yet another person, and then they join in that. These are the dynamics that I'm finding the most exciting. So it's at every imaginable level of the role playing activity.
Why did you choose to revisit Champions and superheroes? What about it suited your skills and interests?
I say with great pleasure that the skills that I may have in terms of promoting the generation of original stories through active play in role playing were taught to me by this generation of champions through the work of people like Steve Peterson and Mike Stackpole and Aaron Alston, and intensive play, returning to those texts and returning to what they thought and what they said and had demonstrated through their own work, and then trying it at our tables, really learning that you generate story by playing hard and fun and caring, and not about either having somebody deliver it to you through preparation, or by fudging everything. This was story through system without the story being locked down in some sort of codified way. Genuinely organic story production, which emerged through using rules. Just fantastic. This was amazing. This was transformative. This has been a primary influence all my life and in all my work in role playing. Now, the topic is also kind of interesting. Arguably, one can say, I think I might have left superhero comic books behind. Um, my whole Comics Madness blog represents a long the return after a long hiatus of kind of just saying, putting it out of my mind and saying that was a period of my life, and then going back and saying, what are these teaching us? What is this? What do these mean to us? How does it relate to a person's life, and how do they relate to the society around them? And that blog, I think, sort of speaks for itself in many ways, but it was there that I finally overcame this sense that I would never do superhero role playing in any really serious way. That, you know what, I kind of felt ready. I said, after doing this and processing all this and having so much feedback and having comics creators come to the blog and having a fellow role players sort of revealing things that I didn't know about them, and all of a sudden connecting so much with others about this material in a way that I think wasn't really fanboyish, but so much more of a joyous reflection that it became precisely the fuel one needs for creative work. Specific skills: player empowerment, the ability to utilize the systemic details, the mechanics of play in a fashion that gives a person agency, impact upon what happens. And I tend not to play in a fashion or to design in a fashion where we're talking about how to narrate afterwards. There's a lot of great design work along those lines. Mine is much more about the decisions in the moment about what to do so that there are trade-offs and that there are differing impacts and especially consequences. I'm real big on consequences and I'm not real big on takebacks and I'm very not on consensus-based play. So the idea that we are collaborating on a story in a kind of consensus, shared author story conference way is very much not where I'm coming from. It's much more in the kind of down and dirty, it's on you, grab this die, oh wait, but if I do this, oh no, then that could happen. All right, I'm going for it or I'm not. All of those things to me are the engines of story construction, particularly when these decisions are less about whether my character lives or dies in this very moment, although they can be, and much more about what's going to happen if I do this, and is that something that I want to do? So all of those things tie in so well to the kinds of comics that we're talking about that I think that element of my design history is very well suited to what's happening here.
So far in the playtest document, you have point buy at the start. I generally like point buy, but a lot of people don't. Why did you choose point buy for character creation, and what do you feel it adds to the play experience?
There's some powerful history there. Champions, the super role playing game, was not the very first role playing game to have point buy and was heavily influenced by a couple of others that came just before it. But it was the first one to introduce uh, different sides of the ledger. For example, you have these kind of negative points and positive ones. And it also was one of the first where the experience that you got was actually in the very same points that you used to build the characters, so that the uh, transitions for characters were very much understandable in a currency fashion. Now, many of the role playing games that have come since are basically adaptations of the way that Champions framed it. One of the most notable that wasn't really an imitation so much as a very intertwined parallel was GURPS. So there's a whole family of game design that was originated or refined into a particular shape here. So in some ways, I guess I'm saying, well, that's the name of the game and that's what we do. But really, let's take a look because after all, I could say, oh well, you know what, this is Champions now. I can junk point by and do it the right way. Well, you know what, it is the right way, and it's the right way because we're talking about characters who make hard choices, characters who have to deal with the crisis of identity, characters who have to deal with crises of society, characters who have to deal with crises of relationships, and also the crises of danger. And all of these things are intertwined among the mechanics of Champions in a fashion that is almost unbelievable until you experience it. And the way the point structure is set up is it gives all of these things the same language, the same mechanical interactions, and a way for them to change relative to one another as play proceeds. So in this case, the points isn't really just a matter of shopping. You might as well throw out the points and just say, pick fire from the list. No, this is much more a matter of investment as a creator and investment as an actor, an agent in the way things are going to go. And so the point by here is literally has a bit of reputation as being awfully fiddly. And I will say there is a point or two that can get, running around your brain to the point of madness. But in principle, and more often than not in operation, it's a thing of beauty. And preserving it, refining it, and saying, okay, let's bring out the most in it is a big part of this project.
What are some elements of the original Champions that you're changing in Champions now?
There are a couple of categories. The first is little ways of managing points and energy that can make a character basically overly cheap to make. And second, make the character inexpensive in terms of their energy for use in play. Now, these are so tempting that even having them as options is basically a greased chute straight into play where none of these variables, the points that you spend or the fatigue of your character, matter a bit. And both of those can be incredibly productive. And so I've basically maintained their original spirit of paying for this stuff, paying to play, if you will, in spades. So that your character, if you have various powers and things, you really have spent some points on them. And then, second, if you are using this character in play, then you gotta manage the tank a little bit and change up your options in the middle of the action. So that's one big family of change, which is more preservative of a particular piece than it is literally going in a new direction. Now, the things that I have in mind that are a little bit more direction oriented, well, is to take a look at this stop motion effect that the famous speed chart can promote. The idea that every character is kind of frozen in place while another character is taking their turn. And it can get a little nuanced and it can get a little bit odd sometimes in play, especially if your character is in full flight from one place to the other and trying to figure out, well, if there are this many segments between their moves, I mean, do they go like extra moves in between, or do we kind of slow them down while others are moving so that they traverse the right amount to get there? It can get a little crazy. So I'm working on two ways to go. One is a completely much more dynamic approach to sequencing, which probably has more in common with Sorcerer and Circle of Hands than it does with Champions. That would be like a big change. Another way is to actually take the speed chart as a virtue and think much more in terms of comics panels so that it's not this metronome of seconds, tick, 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 12 per round, 12 per round, and then we all just kind of fit into the seconds so that fictional time is this really rigid thing, but instead to think in terms of comics panels where there is a great deal of flexibility in terms of just how far someone got. So therefore, having a higher speed means you have done more between the panels, gotten further between the panels. And I think that can be very, very effective at taking the order technique and sort of retooling it conceptually. Being able to change up how you go during the speed chart is another thing that requires a lot of attention. The mix and match of speed and effort and things like that is very important in Champions, and to turn that into a virtue in the sense of that panel activity, that's really something I'm looking forward to hashing out. I've got plenty of models to try through playtesting. Anything else? Well, yes. There are a number, besides little teeny other rules tweaks. Now, putting aside a whole stable of little teeny tiny point tweaks, there's also the larger issue of just how should we be dealing with points? Are we really dealing with something that needs points at this micro scale? I mean, a lot of points to make a character, so there's these teeny tiny atoms involved. Is that really something that we need? Is not the unit of 5 points to 1 die 6 pretty much the fixed standard of activity against which all the other variants are measured? And if that's the case, then we could maybe just call that a 1. Things like that, under which circumstances all sorts of other things may suddenly become more simplified. There are some very tricky uh, relationships among different forms of protection among characters, force field, force wall, damage resistance, armor, all sorts of things like that that bear a good solid look. In this, one can be well instructed by looking at Steve Long's Champion 6th edition, which represents such a re-envisioning of the entire point structure of what this game is. And I definitely see Champions now as being a similar uh, approach, not the similar result or the similar decisions, but the same idea of, well, okay, hold on a second, what really are we talking about in terms of points, dice, construction, and dynamic play? So those are the changes that I have in mind kind of off the top of the list, and there are others that are all kind of subsets of those.
In the Kickstarter, You talk about the renaissance of first wave role playing games. What does Champions Now represent from that renaissance? And what hopes do you have for the future related to this project?
That's the perfect bookends to question number 1. Here goes. In the early 80s, comics to us were the place where stories would explode and go places and be owned and reimagined and driven forward into who knows what by the people who were doing them, and served as a model for that kind of thinking as applied to role playing. In contrast to some of the other genres in role playing, which were starting to look like themselves in a very circular way. Now, today, superheroes are in that same negative position. They're a circle, they're about themselves. You see the Netflix show about the comic, and then you read the comic that somehow sort of seems to have looked just like the Netflix show all of a sudden. And everything is so franchised and locked down, and for years has been subjected to remarkable planning for maximal market impact and speculation based buy and loyalty based buy, and you got to get this one because you had that one, and that's been going on for decades now. Superheroes have been caged and could no longer, in my opinion, play that same role for role players that they did then. Well, I'm saying let's bring that back. Make your own superheroes, make your own comics. They're called role playing. Make your tables the place you go for the superheroes and that vibrancy of the comics medium reinvented through this one that takes on genuine cultural power and personal satisfaction and joy.
Thank you again, Ron, for your time. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to receiving your responses.
Well, thank you, Bree. This was very wonderful. Thank you so much for these questions.